welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario, where we are going to do a follow-up to an episode we did last year with Gregory Keeley on his book, The Many Deaths of Tom Thomson, because in Toronto currently there is an exhibition going on at the Art Embassy entitled Shadow Red, which is all about Tom Thomson. We are fortunate enough to be joined today by the artist of that exhibition, Martha Johnson, joining us live from a cemetery in southern Ontario. Martha, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you.
And I have to say, this is the first time we've done an episode with somebody in a cemetery.
Well, my last name is Johnson, and I happen to be looking at a couple of Johnson tombstones. That's just by happenstance. But yes, here I am on this gorgeous early fall, late afternoon.
Yeah, it's a beautiful day, certainly in Ontario. I feel bad for our friends out west. Apparently it was snowing in either Calgary or Edmonton again this past week, and I've been here complaining about how hot it is in eastern Ontario. I'm looking forward to talking about this exhibit because, as I said to you before we started to record, the art scene in Ottawa, I pay attention to it because I'm here and I can see a lot of it, but across the country, I don't pay that much attention to it. So I'm happy that I was informed about this exhibit about the Tom Thomson mystery, because 2017 is the 100th year anniversary of Tom Thomson's death. And whereas our episode with Gregory Keeley, he had written the book about the many deaths of Tom Thomson, the different theories behind the deaths, you have a very different perspective because you have a familial connection with Tom Thomson.
Yes, my uncle on my dad's side, my Uncle Bill, who is more sort of formally known as Judge William T. Little, was sort of spearheading and was the fellow in the hole in 1956, on Thanksgiving weekend in 1956. He discovered what we believe to be Tom Thomson's remains. I think my Uncle Bill was born in about 1911. I believe he was a counselor at the Taylor-Staton camps on Canoe Lake. And that's kind of halfway, I think, maybe between, Sean, between where I'm sitting and where you're sitting. And he became really interested in the Thomson lore. And by the time he was up there on Canoe Lake at the camps, Thomson had been dead for a while. But the marvelous thing was, most of the players that were friends with Thomson, knew Thomson, were still alive. And he was an impeccable researcher, Uncle Bill, or the judge, or W.T. Little, as Nancy Lang refers to him. And he collected a tremendous amount of information, which was after his discovery, and he had three other friends with him. In 1956, the NFB really became involved, and after the NFB did a number of bits of films, he wrote a book called The Tom Thomson Mystery, published in 1970.
Is this something that you and your uncle had talked about, that you, like at what point did you get interested in this whole story? Is it organically being picked up from him?
It would have been organically picked up, absolutely. I mean, this was always a little bit of a kind of an undercurrent in the family. His eldest son, Tom, is named after Tom Thomson, and I'm an adopted child, not that that's anything much to do with anything. I had wonderfully loving parents, but I was born an artist. So it's not that I was a curiosity, but I was, in any way, it was really interesting. But my Uncle Bill and my cousins, Tom, Jane, Sally, and John, have always been, they always describe me as their artist cousin Martha. So there was this thread absolutely through our lives from the very beginning. So it seemed to be a natural pickup. I happen to have a copy of his book, The Tom Thomson Mystery, that was signed to my mom and dad and to me. I considered it a family treasure. And a couple of years ago, I just decided to reread it again and realized, oh my goodness, this is 2017 will be the 100th anniversary of Thomson's death.
And that's really the interesting part of this whole thing, is that you have this connection. And I mean, as you said before, we'll talk about the exhibit in more detail in a bit, but it takes a long time to put together an exhibit. This is not something that you could have just thought of, oh, it's January 2017, it's time to put together an exhibit about the 100th year anniversary. So this is obviously something that you have a tremendous background in and an interest in prior to this exhibit. And in the fact that you're an artist, was that something that you already had this interest in, this mystery and the idea of what happened to Tom Thomson? And, you know, so much of Canadian art is influenced by Tom Thomson and the Group of Seven. Is that something that for you as an artist, even before your exhibit here, that you were influenced by or took cues from his work?
I would say that not every Canadian artist or painter, you know, I do painting, sculpture, I also do bits of installation. I use whatever medium will work to describe an idea. But I love painting out of doors. And not everybody's up for that. You know, hats blow off. I just took a group of people out with my very dear friends, Janice and Tony Cobb, out to Fogo Island. We had our second annual painting trip out there. And many hats were flying off because we had some windy days. We had gorgeous weather, but not everybody's interested in painting out of doors. It's not for the faint of heart. There can be bugs. There, you know, rocks and sand and bits and pieces can fly into your paint. You've got to be dressed in layers. And I also grew up with a family cottage on Lake Rosso. It was an exquisite, very raw piece of land that was 11 acres, and that was sold about 30 years ago. It was called High Pines. That was the name of the property. Beautiful old, you know, arts and crafts log cabin. And I have to say, that's like the biggest heartbreak of my life. And I think one of the ways, you're absolutely right, Sean, in that notion of how, you know, this just doesn't come of, oh, I think this is a great idea, I think I'll do this, you know, last January. This has been something, you know, all of these things are underground streams that at times maybe come up for air. And, you know, I thought about the loss of Thomson. There's also a female character in the story, a woman named Winnie Traynor, who was a bit of a girlfriend to Thomson. I think Thomson himself was maybe a little bit of a ladies' man, and you might say I can only call it an assumption, and I don't like making assumptions, was that he was not as into Winnie as she might have been into him. I think she cared for him dearly, and Winnie's family was good to Tom, and so, you know, there's a little bit of a sort of a feminine aspect to what I'm doing with my work, but I'm also dealing with, let's say, the loss of High Pines, the loss of the North for me, and in a way I'm thinking about the loss of Thomson. I'm not interested in recreating what he did. I'm not interested in sitting in that place. I think that's greatest, and I think some folks were doing that this summer. I'm interested in those sort of emotional archetypes and why they're part of the Canadian landscape, why they become part of the Canadian artist's experience. And I would say that our panel last week, we were lucky enough to have Stephen Ranger, who's the vice president at Waddington's, and he deals a lot with the contemporary Canadian art scene. And he made a wonderful comment as this plane goes overhead. He made a wonderful comment that was that, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm sorry he's not with me right at the moment, and I can't remember specifically, but he made a wonderful comment about the fact that Canadian art is, and landscape painting, whatever that landscape genre is has a conceptual element now. It probably isn't enough to, you know, just paint trees. And I think if you asked even somebody that did just paint trees, they're going to say, you know, I had an experience with this tree in my childhood. You know, there is an undercurrent there is subtext and there's an emotional depth to what landscape artists are doing in Canada. And I think that's the excitement. How do we all sort of connect, and how do our voices show up visually, let's say? Maybe they show up audibly, too. So I think it's wonderful that we're doing a radio interview about painting, a podcast about painting. I think it's great. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that personal connection is so different from what we do as professional historians. If I can, I don't like that term, but I'm going to use it anyway, as professional historians. Right? What we try and do so often is to separate ourselves to a certain degree from the people that we're studying, and we try to understand them. I mean, it is a humanity after all. You want to understand the human element of what goes on in the past, but you don't want to get too close to it or too involved in it, right? You want to keep that objective distance from what you're studying, which it seems to me in the art that I've seen and just in listening to you talk as well, that artists, or the best art, has that personal connection and almost needs that, or even you crave that, and you really have to care about what it is that you're portraying in order to have it an emotive or an affective piece.
I couldn't agree with you more. God knows, over the years, growing up, even my family would say, "Oh, you're too sensitive, Martha," and I've had situations with friends that will just, they stand sort of with their jaw agape, thinking, like, really? You went that far? Are you making this stuff up? Is that emotional content really there? They don't. I'm paraphrasing again. They won't really say that, but you can kind of tell by the look on somebody's face when you've just stepped into very deep territory, or you've gone swimming. You're far beyond the infinity edge of the pool. You're out, perhaps in the lake where the meteor hit a long, long time ago. And I think that is that sort of energetic flow is the connection for all artists. It's, I certainly look for that, and I'm not satisfied unless, the sort of cream of the story rises to the surface, and I have an emotional understanding of what it is I'm looking at. I've used kind of maybe 3 sort of archetypes, and they've become personal archetypes for me. In the story, I've used the deer, the stag form, like a deer as a talisman. I've used Winnie. There's an object that is part of the installation that is actually a wedding dress that I found when I was in university. I studied fine art at the University of Guelph, and I found this lovely tin silk wedding dress. This would be like 1975 or something, and I've kept it in an ancient case that somebody was throwing out in one of my various living spaces in an apartment building that I lived in, and both the wedding dress and the case come from about that time period. The leather valise or case that I've kept this wedding dress in all these years had White Star, not Titanic stickers on it, but White Star line stickers all over this case. And I've taken this wedding dress, I've put it on a Judy or a dress form, and it typifies Winnie's body to me. It's not an overly decorative dress. It's pretty, and the last painting that I finished up at my family's property on Lake Rosso was a white pine, and that's another one of the sort of archetypes that shows up in this show. I see Tom as the white pine. I see myself a little bit as the white pine. And in fact, it's about the last oil painting that I produced, because I now work pretty exclusively in acrylic when I'm painting. But on this wedding dress, I've taken ribbons and embroidery floss, and I've embroidered on the body of the dress, which is sort of a high-waisted wedding dress. I've embroidered and sort of laced in this one particular white pine. And it goes back to even that that tree, that idea of the metaphor, the tree of life. I mean, that even goes deep back into Egyptian mythology. But, for me, that, some folks might say, oh my God, that's crazy, or geez, that's deep. Or really? And I'll say, yes, really, yes.
Well, I think when most people, or at least people like me, who aren't overly sophisticated in the world of art, go to an art show, for some reason my reaction or my expectation is always to see painting and paintings on the wall. And as you said, I mean, this show has different types of material. So when people go to the show, what should their expectations be, and what, as the artist, are you trying to give them, or what's sort of the overall thesis of the exhibit, if we could put it in those terms?
I think I've worked myself through to rather a place of joy and beauty with this. I'm hoping, and I've been grateful that I've been getting lovely feedback. But you're absolutely right, Sean. I've put in some pieces of sculpture. There's a life-size stag form that is covered in red Hudson's Bay blankets. In other words, think of it as a taxidermy form. It's this beautiful deer that, again, life-size, so let's say about 50 inches high, 30 inches wide, 60 inches long. And one of the other sort of aspects to this show and to my life is I've had this, I'll call it a blanket fetish, and in particular a Hudson's Bay blanket fetish my entire life. My mom, as an only child and a girl, I had these delicious point blanket parkas, that very typical parka that we think of, that kind of a white or cream background, and those beautiful point stripes that one is yellow, one is a sort of a phthalo synthetic green, one is this kind of gorgeous alizarin crimson red, which also ties into the title of the show, Shadow Red, and the other color is black. And I've had friends collecting blankets for me, and I've been collecting them. And one of the centerpieces of the exhibition, well, really sort of the centerpiece and the invitation that you may have seen in the information that's been sent up to you, are these 4 panels of these 4 diggers. Mm-hmm. And they are 4 blankets. And the reason for those blankets is because when Thompson's body was discovered floating in Canoe Lake in 1917, his friends and colleagues covered his body with a blanket. And likely, could have been a Hudson's Bay blanket or perhaps a bird's woolen mill blanket. And that was a small wool factory that is not open any longer, but was in Bracebridge, Ontario. So very close to Canoe Lake and Algonquin Park.
Yeah, so that creates that very personal experience, right? And the sense I get just from reading the material they sent me is that is a way to almost personalize that experience, that when people go, they see the blanket, they see it's not, I mean, blankets, of course, everyone has a blanket, everyone has felt a blanket before, but to see it in the context of a death and that this is used to cover somebody up, it creates a very different experience, I assume, for you as the artist, and then for the visitor in the exhibit to see it and to see it within that context. So there's a much more emotive reaction, I imagine, than seeing in a book, they covered him with a blanket.
Yes, and some of the comments that I've been getting are, that's why the image looks a little different on the invitation, or why did we do this, or my God, this must have been hard to do. And I think there's an aspect of producing visual art, or certainly I'll say that I acknowledge that as a working visual artist in Canada, there's a bit of a cultural attitude in general. Get the cabin up before the snow flies, let's say. That maybe visual art is a bit of a luxury. But, historically, if we look back, there were always artists on ships, and look at the caves at Lascaux. People have created images. It's a way of let's say it's wayfinding. It's cultural wayfinding, and it's not necessarily all that easy to be a visual artist in Canada. We don't have a big population, but we have great stories to honor, and I guess that's sort of why it was important to me to honor my Uncle Bill, the judge. And I think one of your questions was sort of what we're talking about is this sort of thing about back to this blanket, that it's a little bit tough. It was tough to work on that surface. I feel a little bit like Werner Herzog. I hate it, but I love it. And it's been a pleasure, and I'm not going to stop working on blankets. It has a deeper sort of resonance to my work as well, too. But in this case, I think it was a really appropriate material. So not all the paintings are on blankets, but it was an appropriate material to incorporate into this body of work.
And I think that leads to something you mentioned earlier, that you feel as though this exhibit has a more feminine approach, especially in the realm of Tom Thomson's, or the legacy of Tom Thomson, which has been studied a lot by men. As I mentioned, the episode we did with Gregory Keeley and the book that he wrote on the different theories, certainly a lot of it has been governed by male voices, and now here you are taking a more feminine approach to it. And I'm just curious as to what that means to you in terms of putting a more feminine approach on it. Is it related to the materials? Is it perspective? I'm just curious for you, how do you define that feminine aspect of this show?
Well, I'm interested in not answering all the questions. In fact, I'm not sure I'm answering any questions. I'm just paying homage to the players. I suppose I'm paying homage to Tom in that I'm using one of his favorite colors, alizarin crimson. He used to stain canvases that color. And pigments continue to change. Alizarin crimson in his day is a different pigment now, or a different set of pigments. It's actually a mixed color. And then I've even modernized it a little more by using some fluorescent pigments and quinacridone magentas. So it's a little brighter, maybe a little fresher, a little pinker, if you will, in a certain way. I can see just by my approach with some of the subject matter, and I have taken old Polaroids that I took in the 70s that are now, the colors are really deeply saturated, and the images become very soft. And I've made those were photographs of flowers up at my family's property, High Pines, and I've made some paintings from those. I've used surfaces like mylar to keep that softness. And maybe 10 years ago I might have answered by saying I'm not interested in being a female artist. I like sort of running down the middle of things. Can you tell is the work done by a woman or a man? But right now I love the fact that I'm a woman artist, and I've taken this softer approach, let's say. And I'm liking the idea of not drawing assumptions. However, I will say I'm pretty sure that's Thompson. That is Thompson. Those are his bones in the grave, the original grave at Canoe Lake.
But then in the concept of you're not really interested in answering a lot of the questions. As a visitor to the exhibit, or the historian in me, it's not that we always want answers and definitive answers to things, but within this area where there's a lot of uncertainty as to Tom Thomson and what or how he died, and that process, which has to a certain degree influenced his legacy, an exhibit like this, would a visitor not come in expecting some answers?
They might, and I can't know what they're coming in with. If I'm there in the gallery, and I'm going to be doing an artist talk this coming Wednesday on the 27th of September, I'll be able to answer questions for them if I can answer them. I think that mystery is a great ancient thing to be respected. The Greeks and the Egyptians would talk about sort of mystery cults. And we can see maybe even figures in our own current history that are perhaps going to become, let's say, in a way, sort of legend, and stories will spark up about them, and they will take on a different sort of character than what maybe their life was actually like. So I'm quite okay with saying, this is the work that I've produced, and I just want you to enjoy the beauty of it and take what you will from it. There's another piece that I produced on, I think, one of the oldest Hudson's Bay blankets. So, again, I'm talking about that idea that this really is a 100-year-old story. How can I pull it forward? How can I bring it forward? How can I, maybe enhance that shadow or echo of what the group of seven produced? How can the landscape maybe live in our hearts and maybe even on our walls? Some of the imagery that I've produced and some of the ideas that I've worked with, and the one piece that I'm sort of referencing that's on this very ancient blanket. I've taken a drawing of a stag head or a deer head, and I've used, and everybody's been asking me this, did you sew all those beads on? It is a colored visual of a stag head, and it's all glass beads. So it's almost what we refer to in the business as a bas relief. It's almost sculptural. And then, glass trading beads and the history of the wool blanket in this country, that's bringing up something else as well too. And then the fact that I've sort of beaded this entire piece has to do with that idea of women and quilting, or women's work, beadwork, and that handwork. And I see that as, I've been looking at quilts a bit lately, partly because of my trips out to Fogo Island, and there are many quilt makers out in Fogo, and most of them are women. And I was saying to them, when I was out there about a month ago, I was saying, you guys are just painting with fabric. That's, I respect the medium entirely, but have I made a sentence there? I'm not sure.
No. I think it's a good point to make. So one of the things that is really interesting to me is the idea of, as you're talking about, the connection to the nature and this whole environmental thing that we have, and certainly the group of seven popularized a lot of nature art and the idea of taking images from the outdoors and popularizing that imagery. And it's not just in art that this is a thing. Certainly so much of the Canadian mythology is based upon the outdoors and the environment, and some of that is certainly the North, but there's also the idea of lakes and trees and rocks and all that stuff, right? We're a very environmentally conscious country in terms of our imagery and the way we present ourselves nationally, but certainly the environment of 1917 that Tom Thomson had is very different than the environment of 2017, because over the past 100 years, we have done a lot that has been detrimental to the environment. Some of it intentionally, some of it not intentionally. Mass urbanization and the expansion of cities and suburbs and all that. The whole environment has changed. So for you as an artist, putting together this exhibit and tapping into the story of Tom Thomson and this whole environmental aspect of things, how do you confront the changing idea of the outdoors and the changing environment in which we live, and therefore in which you are putting together an exhibit based off of a lot of that previous environmental work?
Oh boy, I think that's wonderfully huge as a topic, and as a concept, as an idea. I can say that this exquisite family property, and I talk to folks all the time. It's, oh yeah, we had one of those too. I felt like the custodian of High Pines, and yet lifetime visual artist, no financial way to keep it in the family. So it, if I say the loss of the North, that means that's one little statement about me and about my persona. And then if we go back to, let's say, 1917, I think that there was a ton of logging that was happening at that time. That's, the North was being plumbed for, its resources. I'm not sure I'm even going to answer this in a very specific way, but I say often folks don't understand the Group of Seven, or let's call it Canadian Impressionism, unless you've sat in Algoma in November. And let's think about, Algoma being a big mining area. So I think the landscape is constantly in flux and change, and I would agree with I like the bent of your question, because I'm always interested in the environment. We're just having our chat, and my bike is sitting beside me, as you know, in the cemetery, and I love it in the cemetery in Toronto because it's quiet and it's an arboretum. And, so it's sort of a living tree zoo, let's say. I think that the Group of Seven would probably say, and their intention in a way was to nobilize or romanticize a lot of the North, and intentionally remove the human element in the story. In other words, a lot of their work, and a lot of landscape painting is not figure in the landscape, or for the Group of Seven was not figure in the landscape. I guess I'm choosing the deer as a bit of a talisman to talk about that custodianship. I keep bringing it back to the personal, and I hope that's okay, because that's the place that I painted from. The year that this family property was sold, there was a deer carcass found on the property, and it was just savaged and decimated. I sort of took that as a bad omen, and I think that's, that something was, I couldn't have imagined that this glorious place was not going to be in my life physically always. And I think I probably look at this glorious green-blue earth as, let's hope we can maintain it. Let's hope we can maintain it. Can't we just all walk a little more if we are able to walk? And be gentler to the environment. And yes, I would absolutely say that was another one of those underwater rivers that's running through the way I think and what I do. We can all just drive a little less and just be a little more thoughtful. It would be good for everybody.
Mm-hmm. To reset. So in that vein, and I don't know if this is conscious, and certainly you can answer it better than I can, whether for Tom Thomson, the Group of Seven, if you know, but for you personally then, when you're doing this work that is environmental, or it does represent the environment in some way, is it a conscious call to action, and not even in a political sense on environmental issues, but sort of this, I always, when I see a lot of environmental work and especially lakes, I like paintings of the stillness of lakes for some reason, but when I see that, to me, it's a call to action from the artist, again, I don't know if it's intentional or not, to preserve it and to say, this is serene, this is beautiful, we have to work to make sure that this is what it is. And when, for you, in your work and in your understanding of Thomson and the Group of Seven, was that ever a part of what that art was about?
I think it has to be, and it's probably so much a part of, I can only speak for myself, my genetic makeup, or my, if I go bugga on you, my soul's makeup, that it is implied and there in every stroke. And I think that, loving our home and looking after our home, and you can bring that back to saying looking after our own physical forms just benefits everybody. Just as this is, in a way, I think this is the most perfect place for me to be doing this podcast with you, Sean, looking at these deep, glorious, ancient living trees all around me. All, as I mentioned before, Mount Pleasant Cemetery is an arboretum. And it's not only the tree above the ground that I'm looking at, it's that old expression of as above, so below. It is such a magnificent whole, and such a stunning system. Boy, when we try and straighten out the rivers, we can make a real mess of things. Yes, my bet is that was a part of what the Group of Seven was doing, and I don't mean to be sounding sour, but I would say I would humble myself to say I'm in awe of what's around me, and I'm also fascinated by that process of, okay, right now I'm looking at this gorgeous maple, and I don't know if it's a Norwegian maple. I think it might not be. I think it's something else, but that idea of looking at it and then reproducing it so that somebody else can recognize it. I think I'm going off on a tangent for you, but that's a mysterious process. That process of art making, whether you're doing something representational or emotional or somewhat abstract, it's a stunning process, and it's a very human process. And I'm going to say it's not straightening out the rivers. It's letting the systems work, letting nature work. Nature works really well. Sometimes it can seem vicious, as we're just seeing in Mexico City and in the Caribbean and around the southern U.S. Oh, it's a big topic. Oh, my goodness. It's a tangent. I better stop now.
No, it's really interesting to talk about, especially in the context of the 100th anniversary of Tom Thomson's death. And it almost seems to me as a reminder or a message or whatever term you want to use, that his death has been popularized, and there's so much around the death and sort of what happened that day that he died that to some extent and for some people has overshadowed some of what his work was about. And it's almost like taking on this naturalist approach to it can help remind us of why Tom Thomson was notable in the first place. Certainly there was a lot of notoriety surrounding his death and almost a scandalous aspect to it, but the reason people knew who he was, even if he wasn't as famous in life as he ended up being in death, was because of his work, and his work was a lot about the nature. So this return to a naturalist perspective, to me, helps inform the exhibit and helps inform the whole anniversary around his death.
I would say yes. I think his, some would say untimely death, rather like Jean-Michel Basquiat, reasonably young man. I believe he was about 38 when Thomson died. I think he was about 38. Maybe that was a little bit of taking one for the team. Maybe that was the sort of, not to be funny, but the eye of the hurricane around, certainly by no means the start of visual art in Canada. You cannot get away from, not that one would want to get away from. In fact, one needs to, we have to absolutely express and hold with reverence any Aboriginal work. I mean, that comes before. And to my mind, one of the most beautiful things about Aboriginal work is it's not influenced by Western culture in any way, and that's profoundly original. And but if Thomson is one of the key figures that sort of galvanizes a Canadian art movement, certainly now, Steve Martin, who introduced, as he said in his talk about a year ago at Roy Thompson Hall, he thought he was going to show Lauren Harrison Canadian art to the Americans, and he was being funny and ironic and sort of flippant about that. But maybe Thompson's death and all of that mystery and intrigue, if that gets folks into getting into looking at paintings and then looking at nature and seeing that exquisite core of beauty and constant change and color and form, then he's like the toe in the door. He's the guy that gets you in, and and then you get to look at Lauren Harris or wonderful Arthur Lismer, who makes, I love Lismer because Lismer's paintings are total discovery and invention and mess. And then that pulls you on further into some of the Quebec artists and Fortin and Robert, and then move into, more contemporary work. I was lucky enough to be mentored by one of the painters, 11, Tom Hodgson. And, there's a Canadian artist that wasn't particularly interested in the landscape other than kayaking and canoeing. But great painter. I'm on a tangent again, John.
No, this is good.
Bring me back.
This is great. And well, with that then,
Good.
Would you say that modern art, Canadian art in 2017, is strong in comparison to what it was 100 years ago? That group of 7 and people like Tom Thomson are so recognizable and so much in the Canadian consciousness of what art is. Is Canadian art, with some of the people you referenced, and certainly there's sort of I think there's a renewed interest in art, and I think Indigenous artists have been more well received recently than they have in the past, and there's been a lot of really great work that's come out. But is it all sort of out of that lineage of the group of 7? And certainly this exhibit obviously is, but on a larger macro scale?
I think you have to acknowledge First Nations, Aboriginal people initially in this country, and the profound statements that are being produced visually. Absolutely. I think that this is more power to our culture, and culture is music, writing, painting. It's everything that we produce that is unique, and I want to keep it on a positive note, and keep that sort of that universal positivity that it's our culture, and we need to treasure that. And I'm saying that as a question. We need to treasure that, and no more so than at this particular point in time, because we have an entirely unique culture, and maybe it is first informed by the landscape itself, by the nature of the landscape, by the St. Lawrence, by the Great Lakes, by the prairies, by the Rockies, by the North, by the Arctic, and coming right back down the coast of Newfoundland. We are so defined by our landscape. Even when I'm teaching people painting, I often use a lot of earth pigment colors, and I say, listen, you are what you eat. We're using some of these greens that look like broccoli. We're the people of the landscape too. Not that we're a race of green people, or a country, I should say a country of green people. there I go off again. But we are defined by our landscape. We are defined by where we live and our weather. I guess that's partly why my interest in blankets. My goodness, yes.
Sure, yeah. I mean, people who live close to the equator certainly don't have the same need for blankets as we do.
No, and they see colors. I can always tell when I've got a student that comes from a warmer climate because they're interested first in hot, crazy bright color. And I have some dear friends that live in the Caribbean, and I get to visit them every once in a while. And it took me a long time of painting in the Caribbean. It took me a while to let the landscape, like a drum, talk back to me and say, okay, these are the colors. Because I initially approached it, if I was doing a sort of a beach rock painting, it might have looked like, Lake Rosso, Lake of Bays, Canoe Lake, rather than the Caribbean. Because that color, that beautiful turquoise sea color wasn't yet a part of my consciousness. I love the landscape talking back to me. I love taking my cue and listening. And when I had my group of folks out in Fogo, and sometimes I'm painting down in New Brunswick, and I'll say, okay, let the landscape tell you what it is. It's not what you think it is. Let it report to you. And I think that might even be yes, Thompson's death is mysterious and interesting and intriguing, but geez, he's a really fine, exciting painter. A really exciting painter.
Yeah, and that's what this exhibit is all about. So the exhibit, again, is Shadow Red. It is on right now until October the 1st at Art Embassy in Toronto. And for those in Toronto, Martha, where exactly is Art Embassy?
That's the lovely old industrial kind of Leaside Thorncliffe Park area. So
okay.
Sorry about this, but it involves Eglinton, and you've got to get a little bit west of Eglinton and a little bit west of the Grand Valley.
Okay, and it's there. The gallery is open 12 to 5 every day, and there is, as you mentioned, the Artist Talk on Wednesday, September 27th, which is the day that this episode is going to go live. So if you hear this in the morning of the 27th, get over to Art Embassy, and you can listen to Martha give her talk and interact, ask questions, and see the exhibit. That is from 10 to noon on the morning of September the 27th. And again, the exhibit Shadow Red at our embassy in Toronto until October the 1st. Martha Johnson, you can also find her work at marthajohnson.ca, all of her work. You got a whole bunch of stuff here, Martha, I have to say. There's a whole bunch. New work, Ken Island, floral, figurative landscape. Grand Manan Island, Survey the Valley, photography, wild. Like, oh my goodness, when do you take a break?
Not very often.
So you can find all of Martha's work there, marthajohnson.ca. And very thrilled to have had you on the show. Martha, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Oh, absolutely, my pleasure. A pleasure, absolutely, Sean. Thank you.
If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is at Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.